The night was heavy with heat, the kind that made the air itself feel like it was holding its breath. Cicadas screamed in the trees, a single lantern flickered by the old oak, and somewhere in the distance, a cry cut through the silence, sharp and short, before fading into the kind of quiet that only happens when something terrible has just occurred. A woman's voice whispered a prayer, trembling through the dark. "Lord, forgive me. I had no choice." Beneath the roots of the ancient tree, the earth was soft, newly turned, and the scent of it rose thick with sorrow. Years later, when the roots split open from age and rain, the truth would rise with them, pale, fragile, and damning. Before we go deeper into this haunting story, make sure you stay till the end, because the final truth is something most people can't bear to hear. The Carter plantation stood on land that bled. Red clay stretched as far as the eye could see, iron-rich and unforgiving, staining every hand that touched it. The house itself was built high on a hill, white pillars gleaming beneath the southern sun, like a temple pretending not to know what sins were buried in the soil beneath it. From a distance, it was a picture of grace and prosperity, laughter spilling from open windows, carriages coming and going, music drifting from the parlor on humid nights. But up close, the air was thick with something else, the smell of sweat, iron, and the faint sweetness of crushed magnolia petals. Dinah rose each morning before dawn, when the world was still gray and the birds hadn't yet begun their calls. She was 17 and had never known a day that didn't belong to someone else. Her hands were small, her voice soft, her eyes dark and steady. But inside them lived an alertness that could see through any kindness, any promise. She had learned early that silence was safer than truth. As the house woke, she moved through it like smoke, cleaning, preparing, serving, a ghost among the living. The Carter family barely knew her name. To them, she was just another hand, another shadow keeping their perfect world spotless. That morning, the eldest son was expected home from the north. The mistress, Eleanor Carter, paced the veranda in her crisp ivory gown, barking orders about linens and flowers. She was the kind of woman who smiled for guests and struck like a whip behind closed doors. Her husband, Colonel Nathaniel Carter, was a man of habit and silence, his pride the size of his estate. They said he had built this house on the backs of 50 souls and never looked back. And now, their only heir, Thomas, was returning, educated, refined, and ready to inherit not just the land, but the burden that came with it. By noon, the air shimmered with heat. The wagons lined the path, and the house buzzed with a nervous kind of joy. Dinah stood by the fountain with a silver tray, her face lowered as the carriages rolled in. Dust swirled around the horses' hooves, and the sound of polished boots striking the gravel made her flinch. When Thomas stepped down, he didn't look like the boy she half remembered, the one who used to sneak peaches from the kitchen window and flash a grin that could melt even the strictest heart. The man who stood before her now had posture carved from marble, his hair slicked back, his voice low and measured when he greeted his mother. But something in his eyes, restless, unsatisfied, betrayed that he had already begun to outgrow the world he was returning to. Their eyes met only once that day. It was by accident, or perhaps not. Dinah was collecting dishes near the doorway when Thomas walked into the dining hall. The room was loud with laughter and talk of politics, but the moment their gazes crossed, the noise seemed to fade. She looked away immediately, her heart stuttering like a bird's wings caught in a cage. He lingered a second too long before turning to speak to his father. No words were exchanged, but something invisible shifted in the air, something neither of them would acknowledge. Yet both would carry from that moment on, that night. As rain began to patter softly on the tin roof, Dinah sat in her small cabin by the edge of the fields. The world outside was dark, the trees whispering with the kind of wind that made you feel like the earth itself was keeping secrets. She looked toward the big house on the hill, its windows glowing gold against the storm. Inside, they would be dancing, toasting, celebrating the return of their son. She could almost hear the faint echoes of the piano, laughter tangled with thunder. And she wondered, just for a moment, what it would feel like to belong to a world that saw her. Upstairs, Thomas lay awake in his old room, the ceiling fan stirring slow circles in the thick air. The plantation's hum returned to him like a memory half forgotten. The smell of tobacco, the hum of cicadas, the quiet footsteps in the hallway below. When he closed his eyes, he could still see the girl by the fountain, the way her eyes had met his without fear. It was a look he wasn't used to, a look that made him feel both powerful and guilty at once. He told himself it was nothing, a trick of the mind. But in the hollow hours before dawn, when the rain stopped and the frogs began their chorus, he found himself listening for footsteps that weren't his own. Outside, the old oak stood silent, its roots deep in the red clay, its branches black against the bruised sky. It had watched generations come and go, each one thinking themselves eternal. But it knew better. It always did. Beneath its vast shadow, the earth waited, patient, dark, and unjudging, for the day when it would be asked to keep another secret. The days that followed were stitched together with the same rhythm as always. Sun up, sun down, work without end. But beneath that rhythm, something had changed. It was small at first, barely a tremor, a look too long, a moment too still. Thomas had returned to his father's estate with every intention of proving himself a man worthy of its inheritance. He wore the mask well, polite, articulate, commanding when required. Yet the deeper he walked into the routines of the plantation, the more those polished edges began to crack. The Carter land stretched wide, from the rolling fields of tobacco to the cypress swamps where mist lingered even at midday. Thomas rode through them each morning, taking account of labor, pretending he understood what it meant to manage men whose lives were not their own. He tried not to look too closely at their faces, the men bent under the weight of their work, the women balancing baskets twice their size, the children running barefoot through mud that clung to them like a second skin. But sometimes, when his horse passed by the quarters, he would catch sight of her. Dinah, carrying water, hanging linens, her movements careful, graceful even in exhaustion. It was not beauty that drew him at first, though she was striking in her quiet way. It was the calm in her, the silence that seemed deeper than the world around her. He began to invent reasons to cross paths. A dropped handkerchief here, a question there, small acts that could be disguised as politeness. The first time he spoke her name aloud, it felt strange in his mouth, as though saying it gave it weight he wasn't ready to carry. "Dinah," he said one evening, standing by the kitchen door where lamplight poured through the cracks. She froze mid-step, the bucket in her hands trembling just slightly. "Yes, sir?" she replied, her voice soft but steady. "You were here before I left for school," he said. "I remember you," she nodded, eyes lowered. "Yes, sir." He should have left it there. But he didn't. Something in her stillness pulled at him, a kind of defiance born from endurance. "You've grown," he added. The words slipped out before he could stop them. She said nothing, only looked at him once, long enough for him to see the fear and the understanding behind her gaze. Then she turned and disappeared into the dark. That night, he told himself it meant nothing. But the next evening, he found himself in the same spot again, watching the door, waiting for the sound of her steps. He was 22 and had never been told no by anyone who mattered. The plantation had taught him that some people existed only to obey. Yet when she looked at him, he didn't feel powerful. He felt seen, and that frightened him more than anything. For Dinah, the danger of his attention was a living thing. She had seen what happened to women who caught the eye of men like him. Some were sent away. Some simply vanished. But there was no avoiding him, not when the house itself conspired to keep her close. She was assigned to the main quarters more often, told to assist with the young master's room, to serve at his table, to attend to his guests. Every command came with a smile that didn't reach the eyes. The mistress, Eleanor, watched closely now, though she said nothing. Her silence was sharper than words. One evening, after the house had quieted, Dinah was ordered to bring wine to the study. Thomas was there alone, reading by the fire, his face lit by a warm glow that made him look older, softer. She placed the tray on the table without a sound, but as she turned to leave, he spoke. Do you ever wonder what it would be like, Dinah, to leave this place? She paused, uncertain if it was a question or a trap. There ain't nowhere to go, sir, she said finally. He set the book down, studying her. That's not an answer. She met his eyes then, for the first time without fear. It's the only one that keeps me alive. The moment hung between them, fragile, forbidden, real. The fire crackled, and in its light he saw her differently. Not as property, not as curiosity, but as something unbearably human. He wanted to apologize for something he couldn't name. Instead, he said nothing. When she left the room, he stood staring at the door long after she was gone, the taste of guilt and longing tangled together in his throat. Outside, the night was deep and heavy. The trees swayed, whispering through the dark like witnesses too tired to warn anyone anymore. In her cabin, Dinah sat awake, the echo of his voice circling in her mind. Freedom, he had said. The word sounded like both salvation and threat. She closed her eyes, praying the wind would take it away. But it didn't. It stayed, lingering like a scent you couldn't wash off. A promise that felt like a curse. And above it all, the old oak stood watching, still, solemn, patient, as if it already knew what would come of the man who thought himself a gentleman, and the girl who had learned to survive by silence. The magnolias bloomed early that year. Their scent hung heavy in the air, thick and sweet enough to make the nights feel fevered. The petals fell like slow rain, blanketing the ground in pale ghosts of themselves, and with them came the illusion of peace, white flowers hiding dark roots. By then, the meetings between Dinah and Thomas had become routine in their danger. They did not begin with a plan, nor end with understanding. Each encounter grew from silence, from the moments that should not have existed but did. It began in whispers, a glance in the hallway, a word spoken too softly to be overheard. But the walls of the Carter house were old, and old walls remembered everything. One night, Thomas found her near the stables, the moonlight slicing through the slats like blades of glass. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice low, her hands clutching her shawl. "Neither should you," he replied, stepping closer, the faint smell of tobacco on his breath. They stood there, separated by air thick with fear. He looked at her as though searching for something he'd lost, something that could absolve him of who he was. When he reached for her hand, she didn't move away, not because she wanted him, but because she didn't dare to refuse. That was the cruelty of it. Choice had never been hers to begin with. The world around them held its breath, crickets silenced, leaves still. For a moment, it felt as if the earth itself was waiting to see what kind of sin would bloom next. Afterward, she told herself it would end there, that the shame and the terror would keep him away. But shame has a strange appetite. It feeds on its own repetition. He came back, again and again, like a man trying to prove something to himself. Each time he promised it would be the last. Each time he broke the promise before it had time to breathe. And she endured it in silence, her heart a storm she could not let show. The other women began to notice. Their eyes followed her when she walked, their whispers curling through the air like smoke. "He's been down by the quarters again," one said. After dark. They all knew who he was. They always knew. Fear and pity mixed in their glances. Dinah felt both their judgment and their protection, though no one dared speak to her directly. To draw attention was to draw punishment, and punishment on a place like this was a thing of blood and rope. The mistress, Eleanor, felt it too. She had lived her whole life pretending not to see her husband's trespasses, but her sons were a different wound, one that cut at her pride. She began to call Dinah into the house for smaller, crueler tasks. Polishing silver that didn't need polishing, scrubbing floors that were already clean, watching her without speaking, her eyes like knives tracing every movement. Once, when Dinah reached for a fallen cloth, Eleanor said quietly, "You think yourself special, don't you?" Dinah froze. "No, ma'am," she whispered. Eleanor smiled without warmth. "Good. Keep it that way." One evening, near the end of summer, Thomas took Dinah to the far edge of the property, a small clearing by the river, hidden by willows. The air shimmered with the sound of cicadas, and the water moved like molten glass. "If things were different," he said, his hand brushing hers. "If the world weren't what it is." He didn't finish the thought. The words were too heavy, too false. Dinah turned to him, her voice quiet but firm. "But the world is what it is, sir." He looked away, shame flickering across his face. In that moment, she understood something about him, that he wanted her not for who she was, but for how she made him feel about himself. Her silence gave him the illusion of goodness. Her fear made him believe he still had a soul. And still, beneath her anger, there was a strange ache, not love, but a deep, exhausted sorrow for the boy he might have been if the world had not been built this way. When she returned to her cabin that night, she found a small magnolia blossom on her windowsill. It was already wilting, its petals bruised and brown around the edges. She didn't touch it, just sat beside it in the dark, listening to the hum of the night, wondering what kind of curse a flower could carry. In the big house, Thomas stared at his reflection in the mirror, the scent of magnolia still clinging to his hands. He hated himself, but not enough to stop. And somewhere between that hatred and hunger, the path toward ruin began to take shape. Outside, beneath the silver wash of the magnolia moon, the old oak swayed. Its roots had long fed on secrets. Now it sensed another one growing nearby, one that would not stay hidden forever. Autumn came to Virginia like a fever that wouldn't break. The fields turned brittle and gold, the sky pressed low and gray, and the air thickened with the scent of decay. Time moved strangely on the plantation. Days felt endless, yet weeks vanished without notice. Dinah worked through them with a hollow sort of calm, her hands still, her mind somewhere deep beneath the surface of herself. She no longer counted mornings by the rooster's crow, but by the quiet dread that came with it. Her body was changing, and she knew it before anyone else did. At first, it was only small things. A wave of nausea at dawn, the tightness in her dress, the dizziness that made her grip the table to stay upright. She tried to convince herself it was the heat, the exhaustion, the lack of food. But denial is a fragile shelter. The truth grew inside her like a shadow she could not hide from. At night, she pressed her hands to her stomach, as if she could somehow undo what had already begun. She prayed for silence, for stillness, for the world to forget her. But the world, or perhaps the house, never did. It was in the kitchen that the first whisper took root. Mary Ellen, an older woman who had worked in the Carter household for decades, noticed before anyone else. She didn't say it outright, only looked at Dinah one morning with eyes that carried both sorrow and warning. "You careful, child," she murmured under her breath. "Ain't no mercy for women like us when the truth start to show." Dinah nodded, her throat tight. She wanted to tell someone, anyone, that she hadn't chosen this, that it was done to her, not by her. But words were dangerous things here. Words could burn faster than any fire. Thomas avoided her now. He'd stopped coming by the stables, stopped asking questions, stopped looking at her at all. Guilt had a way of making cowards out of men, and he buried his in brandy and late-night rides across the fields. To the others, he was still the young master, the heir apparent, but behind closed doors his reflection frightened him. He told himself he was blameless, that what happened had been inevitable, mutual even, the lies men told themselves to survive the things they'd done. But every time he passed Dinah in the hall, the air seemed to close in, thick and suffocating. By the time Eleanor Carter noticed, it was already too late. It happened one afternoon while Dinah was serving tea. The mistress's eyes caught on her shape, subtle but undeniable. The porcelain cup in Eleanor's hand froze midair, and her smile faltered. The silence that followed was thin and dangerous. "You may go," she said finally, her voice flat. Dinah set the tray down and left without looking back, her pulse hammering in her ears. That night, Eleanor confronted her husband. The conversation was brief, quiet, and lethal. The colonel listened, face unmoving, until Eleanor's words cut deep enough to wound his pride. "Your son has brought filth into this house," she said, her tone cold as marble. The colonel's eyes hardened. "Then we will remove it," he replied. No mention of names. No questions. Just a decree, final and absolute. Word spread quickly among the enslaved. It always did. Some said the mistress would send Dinah away to another estate. Others whispered darker things, that she'd be taken into the woods and never seen again. Dinah tried to keep working, to keep breathing, to keep pretending she still had control. But at night, in her small cabin, she felt the weight of the life growing inside her and knew there was no escape. Not from them. Not from this. Thomas found her once more, days later, by the well at dawn. His face was pale, his hair unkempt, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights. "They know," she said quietly, before he could speak. He swallowed hard, his jaw clenched. "I'll fix it," he muttered. But his words sounded empty, like the promises of a man who had never learned what it meant to lose. "You can't fix what's been done," she said, her voice trembling with something that wasn't fear anymore. It was fury. "You'll never carry it." "Only I will." He reached for her hand, but she stepped back. "Don't," she whispered. "Not here. Not now." The distance between them was only a breath, but it felt like a lifetime. He wanted to say he was sorry, but he didn't know how. So he turned and left her standing there, alone beneath the gray morning sky. That night, the air was still. No wind, no crickets. Even the oak stood silent as if it sensed what was coming. In the house, behind closed doors, plans were being made. The colonel's voice carried through the walls like thunder. "This ends before the week is out." And in her cabin, Dinah sat in the dark, her hand on her stomach, her eyes wet but steady. She didn't pray anymore. She didn't beg. She only listened, to her own heartbeat, to the whisper of rain beginning to fall, to the sound of the world turning against her. Somewhere deep within her, beneath the fear, something new began to take root. Not hope, not yet, but something sharper. Something that would one day make the earth itself tremble. The rain did not stop for 3 days. It drummed against the rooftops, filled the ditches, and turned the red clay into slick-sucking mud. The plantation seemed to hold its breath beneath the downpour, its usual rhythm drowned out by the relentless sound of water falling from the sky. Inside the big house, the Carters moved like figures in a play, each performing their role, each pretending not to hear the storm brewing beneath their own roof. Thomas stayed in his room, curtains drawn, the smell of whiskey hanging thick in the air. His father's words still echoed in his mind. "This ends before the week is out." He had wanted to argue, to plead, to confess. But the look in the colonel's eyes had silenced him. There was no reasoning with a man who measured sin by its impact on his reputation. To the colonel, this wasn't a tragedy. It was an inconvenience, a blemish to be removed. Thomas knew what that meant. He'd grown up hearing the stories, the ones the family never told aloud but carried like a ghost between generations. Women who vanished, babies that never drew breath, secrets buried deep enough to make the land itself complicit. Eleanor, meanwhile, moved with cold precision. She had stopped speaking to her son entirely, her silence more damning than any words could have been. At night, she prayed beside her bed, but her prayers were hollow things, twisted with pride. She told herself she was protecting her family, restoring order. But deep down, a quiet envy burned. She hated Dinah not for what she had done, but for what she represented. The reminder that even in chains, a woman could still hold a man's heart. Down in the quarters, whispers grew louder. The others could feel something was coming, something terrible. Mary Ellen took to sitting outside Dinah's cabin each night, her presence a silent act of defiance. "You listen to me, child," she said softly one evening, her voice trembling. "Whatever they do, you don't let them take your soul. They can take everything else, but not that." Dinah nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed it. Her soul felt frayed already, torn between terror and a strange, smoldering calm. On the 4th night, the rain finally stopped. The air was heavy, the ground steaming beneath the sudden sun. Dinah woke to the sound of footsteps outside her door. She sat up, her breath caught in her throat. A man's voice followed, low, familiar, trembling. "Dinah, it's me." Thomas stood in the doorway, soaked to the bone, his coat clinging to him. "They're going to send you away," he said, his voice cracking. "My father has arranged it. You'll be gone by morning." She stared at him, saying nothing. He looked broken, desperate, a child pretending at manhood. "I can't let them do it," he went on. "I'll take you north. We'll leave tonight. There's money." She cut him off with a whisper. "You think you can save me now? After everything?" He stepped closer. "I have to try." She shook her head, her voice barely audible. "You only want to save yourself." The words struck him like a blow. He reached for her, but she stepped back into the dim light of the cabin. For a moment their eyes met, hers steady, his unraveling. "You don't understand," he said weakly. "They'll kill you." "Then let them," she replied, her voice hollow. "At least they'll remember my name." He wanted to argue, but the truth of it was too heavy. Instead, he turned and fled into the night, his boots splashing through puddles, his guilt chasing him like a shadow he couldn't outrun. By dawn, the wagons were ready. 2 men from a neighboring plantation had been summoned, their instructions clear and merciless. Eleanor watched from the veranda as Dinah was brought out, her wrists bound, her face expressionless. The colonel stood beside his wife, hands clasped behind his back, the picture of dignity. "She'll be taken to the river crossing," he said flatly. "After that, she's no concern of ours." But as they led Dinah away, something unexpected happened. Thomas appeared at the edge of the porch, pale and shaking, his voice cutting through the morning air. "Stop!" The men froze. "Unhand her," he ordered. His father's head turned slowly, his gaze sharp as glass. "You will not make a scene," the colonel said. "I already have," Thomas replied. For a moment, time seemed to split open. Father and son stood facing each other, the space between them heavy with everything unsaid. Love turned to resentment, power turned to poison. Then, without a word, the colonel raised his hand. The 2 men hesitated only briefly before seizing Dinah again, dragging her toward the wagon. Thomas lunged forward, shouting, but one of the overseers struck him hard across the face. The sound echoed like a gunshot. When the dust settled, the wagon was gone, and the house was silent. That night, the colonel sat alone in his study, staring into the fire. His son's defiance gnawed at him, but deeper still was the unease he could not name. The storm outside had ended, yet he could still hear the sound of rain in his head, steady, relentless like footsteps on wet earth and miles away. Beneath the shadow of the old oak, Dinah sat in the back of the wagon, her hands shaking, her mind clear. The men thought she was broken. They were wrong. She was waiting, for her chance, for her moment, for the one truth she still held power over. How the story would end. The air around her smelled of clay and moss and coming thunder. Somewhere above, a crow called once, low and long, like a warning. And beneath it all, the earth whispered her name. The wagon creaked as it rolled through the lowlands, its wooden wheels sinking deep into the muck of the swollen path. The horses strained against their harnesses, nostrils flaring, as mist rose from the drenched earth in pale ribbons. Dinah sat in the back, her wrists bound, her dress heavy with the damp. The 2 men guarding her barely spoke, save for muttered curses about the rain and the mud. The sky above was a dull pewter, heavy with clouds that hadn't decided yet whether to break again. They were headed toward the river, the crossing where the Carter land bled into the neighboring counties. Beyond that, the men had been told to hand her off. What happened after wasn't their business. Maybe she'd be sold. Maybe she'd vanish into one of those places where no one asked questions. But even as the wagon bumped along, Dinah's eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. There was no fear in her face now, only something quiet and ancient, the look of someone who had already crossed all the rivers that mattered. At midday, they stopped beneath a grove of cypress trees to water the horses. One of the men, a thick-shouldered overseer named Briggs, wiped his brow and glanced toward her. "You best pray, girl," he said, his voice lazy with contempt. Ain't no mercy where you goin'. Dinah met his gaze. Ain't none here either, she said softly. He looked at her a moment longer, then spat into the mud. The other man laughed, a short, nervous sound, and the two went back to their canteen. When they weren't looking, Dinah leaned slightly, feeling for the small sliver of iron she'd hidden in her sleeve weeks ago. A nail, bent and dull, stolen from the floorboards near the hearth. It wasn't much, but it was something. She began to work it against the rope at her wrists, careful to keep her movements small and steady. Each fiber that gave way felt like a heartbeat returning. By the time the wagon reached the riverbank, her wrists were slick with blood but free. The men didn't notice at first. They were too busy arguing about how deep the crossing had gotten since the last flood. The river was swollen, the current fast and angry, dragging branches and debris downstream like bones in the dark. The ferry they expected to find was gone, washed away most likely. Guess we'll camp till morning, Briggs muttered. Dinah's chance came when the second man turned to unhitch the horses. She moved quick, a blur of motion and instinct. Her hands shot out, grabbing the edge of the wagon. She swung the loose rope hard, catching Briggs across the face. He stumbled back, cursing, just as she lunged for the other man's pistol. The shot went wide, echoing across the water. Birds burst from the trees. For a moment it was chaos, shouts, mud, gunpowder. Dinah didn't think, didn't plan. She ran. Her bare feet hit the slick earth hard, the pain sharp but distant. She plunged into the shallows, the cold biting through her skin. The men shouted behind her, one firing again, the sound swallowed by the rush of the river. The current pulled at her skirt, dragging her down. She fought, gasping, clawing at the water. For an instant she went under, swallowed by the dark. The world above vanished, and the river spoke in the voice of 1,000 dead things. When she surfaced, she was downstream, choking, clinging to a branch that jutted out from the far bank. She hauled herself onto the mud, trembling, her body shaking with cold and adrenaline. Behind her, the shouts faded, replaced by the endless sound of rushing water. She was free, or at least as free as a hunted woman could be. She lay there for a long while, watching the gray light shift through the trees. Every sound made her flinch, the crack of branches, the distant bark of dogs. But none came close, not yet. When she finally stood, her legs felt weak, but her eyes were steady. She turned her face toward the east, where the land rose and the woods grew thick. Somewhere beyond those trees lay the old paths, the hidden ones the elders whispered about, the roots carved by those who'd fled before her. As she walked, the weight of it all pressed down on her. The house, the whispers, the child she still carried beneath her ribs. But the fear that had once held her captive was gone. In its place was something colder, sharper. Vengeance wasn't the right word for it. Vengeance was too clean, too human. What lived in her now was older than that. By the time night fell, she'd reached the edge of the marshlands. The air smelled of rot and moss, and the frogs sang in the reeds. She found a hollow beneath a fallen tree and curled inside, shivering. In the distance, thunder rumbled again, faint, far away. It made her think of the colonel's house, of Thomas, of the life she'd been forced to abandon. A strange calm came over her then. She whispered into the dark, not a prayer but a promise. "You'll see me again." Miles away, back on Carterland, Thomas was unraveling. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. When word came that the men had returned without her, his mother fainted on the stairs. The colonel said nothing, only poured himself another drink. "It's over," he said simply. But Thomas knew better. Somewhere deep inside he felt it, that the story hadn't ended at the river. It had only begun. Outside, the wind began to rise again, stirring the trees until they whispered like restless spirits. And in that whisper, faint but clear, the land itself seemed to answer back. The air over Carterland had changed. You could feel it before the storm came, a heaviness that pressed against the skin, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. The clouds gathered slow and deliberate, crawling across the horizon like bruises spreading over pale flesh. The fields, once gold and green, now looked gray and lifeless. The workers whispered of bad omens, of voices at night by the old oak, of a figure seen walking the edge of the woods with her head uncovered and her dress torn. Some swore it was just the wind. Others said it was her, Dinah. Thomas hadn't left his room in days. He sat by the window with the curtains drawn, watching the rain smear the glass into shifting shapes. The house felt hollow now. His mother spoke only in murmurs, her words lost somewhere between prayer and denial. The colonel carried himself with the brittle calm of a man who'd convinced himself control was the same as redemption. Yet even he had started to flinch at the smallest sound, the creak of a door, the cry of an infant from the quarters, the low groan of wind against the eaves. One night, as thunder rolled like distant drums, Thomas thought he heard her voice, faint, broken by the rain. It came from beyond the courtyard, near the slave quarters, a soft humming that threaded through the storm. He pressed his ear to the window pane, breath-catching. The melody was the one she used to sing to the baby, a tune that never had words, only sorrow. He stood slowly, heart pounding, and moved toward the door. Downstairs, the hall was dark. The portraits on the wall flickered in the candlelight, their painted eyes watching him pass. He stepped outside, the cold rain biting through his shirt. The humming stopped. For a moment there was nothing but the wind. Then, movement. Near the old oak, a figure, slight and still, standing with her back to him. His breath caught in his throat. "Dinah?" he called, his voice shaking. The figure turned, or seemed to. Lightning split the sky, lighting up her face for a single heartbeat. It was her, but the eyes that met his weren't alive in the way he remembered. They were calm, knowing, and impossibly sad. He stumbled forward, but by the time the next flash came, the space beneath the tree was empty. Only the swing that hung from the old branch swayed gently, creaking in the storm. By morning, word spread that one of the overseers, Briggs, had been found dead near the riverbank, his throat torn open by something no one could name. The colonel called it an accident. "Wolves," he muttered. But no one had seen wolves on the property in years. The men grew restless. Some refused to work past dusk. The women whispered of the curse, of the price unpaid. That night, Thomas went back to the oak. The earth beneath it was soft, disturbed. He knelt, fingers trembling, and dug through the mud until his hand touched something, cloth, small and fragile. A baby's blanket. He pulled it free, the edges frayed, the fabric still faintly smelling of milk and smoke. He felt the world tilt. He had buried that night so deep inside him, convinced himself it had been a nightmare. But the truth was right there in his hands, undeniable. Behind him, a low voice whispered his name. He froze. Slowly he turned. Dinah stood at the edge of the trees, her dress soaked, her hair plastered to her face. She looked alive, but the way the light bent around her made it impossible to tell where she ended and the rain began. "You promised," she said. Her voice wasn't angry. It was tired, heavy with something deeper than grief. "You said you'd save us." Thomas stepped forward, tears already burning his eyes. "I tried," he whispered. "God, I tried." The storm surged, drowning his words. She took a step closer, and for the briefest moment, he saw the child in her arms, small, wrapped in the same blanket he held. Lightning tore through the clouds again, and then she was gone. Only the wind remained, howling through the branches like a lament. Thomas fell to his knees. The rain soaked through him, mingling with his tears. He didn't move until dawn, when the storm finally broke, and the first pale light spilled across the land. When he rose, the ground beneath the oak had changed again. The roots were exposed, the earth split open as if something had clawed its way free. Back in the house, the colonel poured his morning drink and tried to ignore the sound of the servants whispering. He was pale, his hands shaking slightly as he lifted the glass. He looked out the window and saw his son walking across the yard, mud caked up to his knees, eyes empty. For the first time, the old man felt a tremor of fear he couldn't name. That night, he dreamed of the oak, its branches heavy with shadows, its roots dripping blood. When he woke, he found his boots still wet, though he hadn't left his bed. Outside, the cicadas had gone silent. Even the land seemed to be waiting. The storm had passed, but the silence it left behind was worse. It wasn't peace. It was a waiting kind of quiet, thick and unnatural, as if the air itself feared what might come next. The sun broke through for the first time in days, but its light felt pale, sickly, unable to warm the earth. The fields glistened with water, every furrow filled with rain that reflected the gray sky like glass. The Carter estate looked smaller in that light, stripped of its grandeur, reduced to a trembling house on haunted ground. Thomas wandered through the halls as though lost inside a memory. Every creak in the floorboard sounded like a whisper calling his name. Every reflection seemed to move when he wasn't looking. His mother had taken to praying aloud at all hours, clutching her rosary until her fingers bled. The colonel avoided her eyes, drowning himself in work he could no longer keep straight. He spoke less, drank more. Even the servants moved like ghosts now, their faces drawn, their gazes shifting toward the windows whenever the wind blew. By the third day, Thomas stopped sleeping altogether. He began to hear the crying again, soft, rhythmic, unmistakable. It would come just before dawn, near the east wing, where no child had lived for months. He tried to tell himself it was a trick of the wind, but deep down he knew better. He had held that sound in his arms once. He remembered the weight of it, the tiny heartbeat against his chest, before everything had gone wrong. On the fourth night, he went to his father's study. The colonel sat in the dim light of a single candle, the smell of whiskey thick in the air. "Father," Thomas said quietly. The old man didn't look up. "You see her too, don't you?" The colonel's hand froze midway to his lips. For a long time he didn't answer. Then slowly he said, "There are things best left buried, boy. Ghosts only come if you call 'em." Thomas stepped forward, his voice shaking. "I didn't call her, you did. When you buried her like an animal. When you told them to take her." The colonel slammed the glass onto the desk, the sound sharp as gunfire. "Enough," but his voice cracked. His face was drawn, his eyes bloodshot. For the first time, Thomas saw not power, but guilt. "You think I wanted any of this?" The old man rasped. "That girl ruined everything. She shamed this house. I did what was necessary." Thomas stared at him, stunned by the smallness of it. How a man could destroy so much and still believe himself righteous. "Necessary?" he said, his voice low. "You murdered a woman. You murdered my child." The words hung in the air like smoke. For a heartbeat, the room was utterly still. Then the candle flickered, once, twice, and then went out. The darkness swallowed them both. When the light returned, faint and unsteady, the colonel was standing. His face had gone pale as paper. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. Thomas did. The crying had come again, but it wasn't distant now. It was in the room. The sound was soft at first, the thin, wailing sob of an infant, then clearer, closer. The colonel turned slowly toward the sound, eyes wide. In the far corner, the shadows shifted. Something was there, a shape just barely human, cradling something small against its chest. The faint shimmer of a white cloth caught the candlelight. Then a voice. "You said it was God's will?" Thomas felt the breath leave his body. Dinah stepped forward, her feet leaving no trace on the rug. The colonel staggered back, hand trembling as he reached for the pistol on his desk. But before he could lift it, the sound came again, the infant's cry, loud now, echoing through the room. The pistol slipped from his fingers. She looked at Thomas then, her eyes softer, as if she still saw the boy she'd once known beneath all the ruin. "You tried," she said, "but you let them take me anyway." "I was a coward," Thomas whispered. "I know that now." The colonel choked out a sound, half a curse, half a prayer. "Get out!" he shouted, voice breaking. "You're dead!" Dinah turned to him. "So are you," she said. The candlelight flared, then died completely. The scream that followed was short and terrible. When the servants found the colonel in the morning, he was slumped over the desk, his eyes open, his mouth twisted in horror. His skin was cold, his body rigid. There were no marks, no sign of struggle, just the faint smell of river water and the whisper of a lullaby still hanging in the air. Thomas didn't stay for the funeral. He couldn't. He walked down to the oak that night, the same tree where she had stood in the storm. The ground there was dry now, the mud hardened, but the roots still bore the stains of what had been buried. He knelt, pressing the blanket, the one he'd found, against his face. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'll never forgive myself." A breeze stirred the branches above him, soft and low, like a hand brushing his hair. He closed his eyes. For the first time, the silence felt different. Not heavy, not waiting, but peaceful. When he opened them again, the night sky was clear, and the stars were reflected in the wet earth below, countless and still. He stood there until dawn, until the first light touched the old oak. In that gray, trembling quiet, he thought he saw her once more, not as a ghost, but as a woman, whole and free, walking toward the river that had once taken her. She didn't look back. She didn't have to. Morning came to the Carter estate as if the world itself had exhaled. The sky was washed clean, the storm clouds scattered and thin. For the first time in weeks, the air smelled of sunlight and wet grass instead of fear. Yet the house, despite the brightness outside, felt darker than ever. The black crepe that hung from the doors fluttered gently in the breeze, a hollow gesture for a man whose sins had outlived him. The colonel was buried beneath the same oak that had stood watch over his family for generations. No priest would come, no neighbor dared attend. The servants gathered in silence, their faces unreadable. Some whispered prayers, others simply watched, waiting for the earth to close over the man who had ruled them with cruelty and lies. Thomas stood apart, coat unbuttoned, hair unkempt, his eyes red from nights without sleep. He said nothing. When the final clod of dirt fell onto the coffin, he turned and walked away, never once looking back. The house began to empty itself after that. One by one, the workers left, taking only what they could carry. His mother retreated to her room, fading like the curtains that once framed her proud figure. She spoke to no one. She didn't even speak to God anymore. The echo of her rosary beads had stopped. The maids said they heard her whispering to someone who wasn't there, a woman's voice answering softly through the walls. Thomas drifted through those days as if underwater. He ate little, slept less. He avoided mirrors, for every reflection seemed to shift into something else, a flash of a face, a shadow that lingered too long. The house moaned at night, and he'd catch himself listening for footsteps that never came. Still, he stayed. He told himself it was guilt that kept him tethered, but deep down he knew it was penance. The land demanded its watchers, and he had become one, the last heir to a curse too deep to bury. On the 7th night after the funeral, he went to the oak again. The air was still, the moon low and red. The ground around the roots had settled, but something about it seemed different, smoother, as though someone had tended it. He knelt beside it, tracing the dirt with his fingers. There, half buried in the soil, was the locket he'd given her years ago, the one he thought he'd lost. Inside was a lock of hair, pale and brittle, and a tiny scrap of paper stained by water but still legible. 2 words, "He forgives." The message wasn't hers. He knew her handwriting too well. Sharp, deliberate, like carved wood. This was different, trembling, desperate. His father's hand. The discovery should have brought relief, but instead it hollowed him out even further. Forgiveness was not a thing that could be written. It had to be lived, and it was far too late for that. A sound stirred behind him, the rustle of leaves, a whisper like breath against the back of his neck. "You've stayed," came the voice. Dinah's voice. Calm, steady. Why? Thomas closed his eyes, the ache in his chest swelling until he could hardly breathe. "Because I have nowhere else," he said. "Because leaving would mean I learned nothing." When he turned, she was there again. Not in fury, not even in sorrow. but in the quiet acceptance of someone who had crossed beyond both. The moonlight passed through her like mist, silvering her outline. She looked at him for a long time, her gaze searching. "The land remembers," she said. "It always does, but it don't always punish." He swallowed hard. "Then what does it do?" "It waits," she answered, "for someone to plant something better." Then she was gone, not vanished in an instant, but fading like morning fog. The wind moved through the trees, soft and low. He sat there long after she disappeared, until the night thinned into gray dawn. For the first time, he noticed the buds beginning to form along the oak's lowest branches, small, trembling things reaching toward the light. By spring, the estate was empty. Thomas sold what was left, gave the money to those who had once worked the land, and left Virginia behind. Some said he went north. Others said they saw him walking the back roads alone, always heading toward rivers. The house rotted slowly, the paint peeling, the windows shattering one by one. Only the oak remained strong. It grew fuller each year, its roots deeper, its leaves thicker, until it seemed to stand not as a symbol of what had been lost, but of what had endured. And sometimes, when the evening light slanted just right through its branches, travelers swore they saw a woman beneath it, head bowed, a child in her arms humming a tune that had no words. They'd say the sound was beautiful and unbearable all at once. If they lingered too long, the air would grow cold, and the melody would stop. And all that would remain was the whisper of the river nearby, forever carrying away what the living could not. Years passed, and the Carter land fell to silence. The house that once stood proud among the fields became little more than a skeleton of itself, its windows shattered by storms, its porch leaning into the earth. The walls still whispered when the wind came through, as if remembering every voice that had ever echoed there. The laughter, the lies, the cries. The stories clung to the land long after the people were gone. And beneath the old oak, where the roots reached deep into the soil, something of them remained. It was spring again, the kind that came slow and uncertain, with the kind of light that carried both warmth and warning. The trees were heavy with new green, and the air smelled of earth and river. A stranger rode down the dirt path one afternoon, his horse kicking up dust where the fields had once grown thick with tobacco. He was a quiet man, broad-shouldered, with eyes that had seen too much for his years. When he reached the ruins of the house, he dismounted and stood still for a long time, studying what was left. He didn't know the place, not truly. He'd only heard the whispers in town, the stories of a cursed plantation, a mad family, a woman wronged by both love and God. But something had drawn him here all the same, something he couldn't name. He walked slowly toward the oak. The tree was enormous now, its trunk wide enough to swallow a wagon. The ground beneath it was soft, dark, and rich, as though it had been fed well. He felt a strange pull toward it, the way a man might feel standing before the grave of someone he'd never met, but somehow missed. He knelt and brushed away the leaves, revealing the remnants of an old iron marker, half swallowed by the soil. The words were almost gone, but one line was still clear. For what was buried is not forgotten. The wind moved through the branches above, carrying the faint scent of river water. He looked up, and for a moment, he thought he saw her. A woman in a plain dress, standing just beyond the sunlight, her head bowed as though in prayer. When he blinked, she was gone. But the feeling she left, a deep, aching sadness mixed with something like peace, stayed. The stranger spent the night beneath the oak. He built a small fire and sat beside it, the flames casting trembling light against the tree's rough bark. He took from his pocket a folded paper, worn thin from years of handling. It was a family record, names and birth dates written in fading ink. His mother's name sat halfway down the page, Dinah Carter, born 1820. His thumb rested on it, tracing the curve of the letters. He had never known her, not really. He'd been told she died in childbirth, that her body was laid in an unmarked grave. But as he'd grown older, he'd begun to dream of her, dreams too vivid to dismiss. She would stand at the edge of the river, calling him by a name no one else had ever used. Sometimes in the dream she was singing. Sometimes she was weeping. And sometimes she was silent, staring at him as though waiting for him to remember something he couldn't quite reach. He looked up at the branches now, black against the stars. "I found you," he said quietly. The wind stirred, and the oak seemed to answer with a soft creak that sounded almost like a sigh. "I don't know what you want from me," he continued. "But I came," the fire crackled. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called once, then again. He lay back in the grass, watching the embers float upward. Sleep came slow, heavy. And in that sleep, the dream came again. Only this time it was clearer. He was a child, standing at the edge of a river swollen with rain. A woman knelt beside him, her hand warm against his cheek. She didn't speak. She only smiled, a sad, knowing smile, and pointed toward the water. When he looked down, he saw their reflections together. But hers didn't move when he did. It watched him instead, eyes steady and full of something he'd never understood: forgiveness. He woke before dawn. The fire had burned to ash, the air cool and still. The first light of morning slipped through the branches, painting the ground in gold. He rose slowly, stretching the ache from his bones. At the base of the oak, the soil looked freshly turned, as if something had shifted in the night. He crouched and placed his hand there, feeling the pulse of the earth, faint but alive. And then he understood. The stories weren't warnings. They were roots. What had been buried wasn't a curse at all, but a seed, one born of pain and watered by truth. The land didn't hunger for vengeance anymore. It hungered for remembrance. He took the marker that had fallen and set it upright again, pressing it deep into the soil. Then, from his satchel, he drew a small wooden cross carved by his own hand. He planted it beside the old iron, not as a monument, but as a promise. "For Dinah," he said softly, "and for the child." When he rode away later that morning, the oak stood silent behind him, its leaves whispering in the wind. But if someone had been there to listen closely, they might have heard another sound, faint, like the echo of a lullaby carried through the branches. The kind of song that belongs not to the living or the dead, but to the memory that binds them both. And as the sun rose over the Carter land, the river shimmered in the distance, no longer the boundary it once was, but a mirror reflecting what remained of their story: love buried in shadow, pain transformed into roots, and the truth that no man, however cruel, can keep the past beneath the earth forever. The air beneath the old oak had come home, and the land at last was quiet,